Welcome to The Verdict. Kent Myers flying solo again this Sunday. However, Mick Cornett will be back in a couple of weeks. He's got some outside activities that have him engaged. As we said last week, we're engaged in a two-part series to discuss charter schools. We had Senator David Holt on last week, kind of giving the pro side, if you will. We're going to have Representative Scott Inman come on and talk about the other side or other thoughts about charter schools. What we hope you'll have when we finish this series is a way to figure out what you think about charter schools, weighing both the pros and the cons and the pluses and the minuses. So sit back, get you another cup of coffee. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with Representative Scott Inman talking about second thoughts about charter schools.
I've been fortunate enough to premiere every film that I've produced at Sundance. Seeing your film on the big screen for the first time in front of an audience at the Sundance Film Festival is unmatched. I'm Chad Burris. I'm an attorney, a film producer, film financier, economic development financier, and I'm Chickasaw. Nobody can argue that modern day media, cinema, has perpetuated this myth, this idea of the Indian and what that is. And just the idea that, all Indians look one way or all Indians act one way is a terrible injustice. Being able to have filmmakers tell stories that are representative of some element of his surroundings, his upbringing, what they know, what they see through their own eyes, that other people get a chance to bear witness to around the world. I think that's amazing. For me personally, being an Indian today means being responsible, honest, progressive, and giving that back to the community.
Learn more about today's Chickasaws at profilesofanation.com.
Welcome back to The Verdict for our second show on charter schools in Oklahoma. We are really pleased today to have join us Representative Scott Inman from District 94 of the Oklahoma House of Representatives. Scott grew up in Del City, Oklahoma, and as a matter of fact is the first person who grew up in Del City to represent Del City in the House of Representatives. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Oklahoma, where he graduated summa cum laude. He did his law work also at the University of Oklahoma. In 2007, he was elected to the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and he, as I say, is the first person to be representing Del City who actually went to school in Del City. He's received numerous awards for his legislative achievements. Lots of recognition. He has been designated by Chuck Todd of the NBC show Meet the Press as a rising star in politics. Quite a nice honor. This is Scott's first visit to The Verdict, and we're sure glad to have you. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Kent. I'm glad to be here. Absolutely.
Well, we're really pleased to have you here. We started David Holt's show last week with his view about the pluses and minuses of the most recent concluded legislative session. Can you answer the same question? How do you view this session we just ended?
Yeah, we had some struggles. I mean, anytime you're looking at a budget deficit, which we were looking at this year, on the heels of years and years of underfunding things like education and health care and public safety, you're going to have struggles, and we did. And when we finally came out of this particular session, while there were a few winners when it came to some mental health folks and some folks in corrections and a few other areas that saw a little bit of an increase in dollars, on the whole, public education, for example, which is sort of my passion, we're still about $400 million below where we were in 2008 when you adjust for inflation. And that's on top of adding 50,000 new students over that time. And I think we started the year out about 1,000 teachers short. So you have that you're facing. You look at what happened to our county improvement for roads and bridges funds. We had all the flooding this particular year and all the roads and bridges that were washed out. In that environment, the legislature took about $75 million out of a fund that was set aside solely for county roads and bridges that could have been used to help repair those bridges. And so you look at it and say, well, our folks out in rural Oklahoma were kind of the losers in this particular session because of that. And so you have some winners, some losers. On the whole, it was a difficult session because of the budget constraints. But it seems to be the par for the course the last 3 or 4 years.
What's going to happen to those roads and bridges that may not be able to be repaired? I mean, are those folks just going to suffer?
Well, I hope not. I mean, what's going to happen is what I've actually said is going to happen for a number of years now. And we had an income tax cut that went in, that's going to go into effect here in a few months. My caucus, I'm the minority leader in the House of Representatives, and I called upon my caucus and others to say, why don't we slow this tax cut train down a little bit, because we can't afford to fund core functions of government. Why don't we not put the tax cut on the books yet, use some of those monies, about $120 million. When it's fully implemented, it'll be about $250 million. Why don't we use some of that money to help fund education and roads and bridges, things like that? They said, no, we're going to take money out of roads and bridges and cut taxes, which they did. What I'm afraid is going to happen now is because the state isn't able to properly fund core functions of government, you're going to see that burden pushed down locally. And so local counties, local municipalities are going to have to start raising taxes on their own citizens in order to pay for those roads and bridges. You've seen it happen in some counties already for health care and corrections. Now I'm afraid they may have to do it for roads and bridges, and that's really unfortunate because a lot of our rural folks and our farmers and ranchers can't afford to pay higher property taxes and sales taxes right now.
Let me ask you, did the legislature dip into the rainy day fund this session?
They did. They dipped into the rainy day fund for several $100 million. Which
kind of appropriate label this year for the rainy day fund.
It was. Not only was it actually pouring outside for months, but it was truly raining when it comes to our budgetary situation. They dipped into it a little bit, but they left several $100 million left in there. And my caucus said, why don't you use another $100 million out of the rainy day fund, which had about $600 million in it going into it. Why don't you use another $100 million out of that instead of stealing it from roads and bridges? They chose not to do that, and I think that was a mistake, but that's politics and the way the government works, I guess.
Well, that's the system we have.
It is.
Let's talk now about charter schools.
Absolutely.
How and why did charter schools get started in Oklahoma? David talked a little bit about it, but I'd be interested in your view.
Well, I mean, it started in Oklahoma much the same way that charter schools started around the rest of the country. As you have people come in and say, we realize we have some significant challenges in our public schools. A lot of times we have significant challenges within the inner city public school system in like Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Lawton. And so they're trying to find a solution to try to help raise the educational quality for our students in Oklahoma. That's sort of the impetus behind it. However, there's pros and cons with it. I know Senator Holt probably touched on several of those. From my perspective, while charter schools certainly can play a role in an overall education picture for our kids in public schools, at the end of the day, 680 some odd thousand kids are in our public school system, and we need to make sure we properly fund those, properly have enough teachers, properly pay them, and then charter schools can play a small component of that. I'm afraid now at the Capitol what's happened is there's been more and more focus away from increasing teacher pay, taking care of things in the public school classroom, and instead of just putting more money into private schools, vouchers, and charter schools, and I think that's unfortunate.
Well, when a charter school comes into a particular community, they have to probably draw their students from that community. In essence, it's not truly a local school, but it's a community school. What happens to those public schools that lose those students to the charter schools?
Yeah, that's part of the issue that I've always had with it is you have to, how do you look at the system? Do you look at the system as to say we want to help improve a particular school, or we're just going to handpick a few kids and pull those out and just take care of those? Because a lot of times when you have a voucher program or a charter school program, what you end up doing is selecting a few kids out of a bad school or a school that's struggling. You allow those kids to get out and you leave everybody else behind. Well, by nature, the kids whose parents are engaged enough to be able to pull them up out of that school and put them into a charter school, those kids generally have some better advantages than the kids left behind. My argument all the time is that charter schools aren't bad, and it's not that there's not a need for it, but I believe that we're in the situation we are in right now, not because we have bad teachers or bad kids, it's because the devolution of the family unit. I mean, the family unit in Oklahoma and around the country is sort of devolving. You've got a lot of single mothers trying to work 1 or 2 jobs who can't be home to make sure her kid is doing the homework and getting to bed on time and not playing video games and not eating bad food that's not healthy for them. There's your real problem. And if you go into the inner city, Oklahoma City, and look at those real challenges, you see kids who are faced with that. They see a lot of crime in their neighborhood. They don't know who their father is. Well, you can take them and put them in any charter school, any private school, and as long as that situation still exists back home, that kid's going to continue to struggle. And so my point is if you want to use charter schools as a tool in the toolbox, as they say, that's fine. But until we actually attack the real root of the problem, we're going to just be throwing good money after bad, I'm afraid.
We have approximately, I think, 25 or so charter schools now, and I guess primarily in the Oklahoma City and Tulsa areas.
That's right.
Are there other areas right now where there are charter schools?
Well, no, that's principally where they are. They've
Yeah.
talked about legislation this year to expand those charter schools out into rural Oklahoma, and we can touch on that in a minute.
Yeah, I'd like to hold that for the
Yeah, absolutely.
second
But
half.
I think something that should be pointed out is that that sometimes the charter schools are considered to be the panacea. They're the cure-all. We just allow charter schools in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and it'll solve all of our problems. Stanford, at the Center for Research and Economic Development, Center for Research and Education Outcomes, the Stanford Institute, they went and studied all the charter schools nationwide. And the studies came back and showed this, that about 17% of the charter schools and the students in those charter schools nationwide do better than the average school that they were in before. About 37% actually do worse. And then the rest of the ground, about 46% of them do about the same. And so statistically speaking, if you're someone who wants to pull your kid out of a regular school and put them into a charter school, you got to know that there's about a 1 in 5 chance they'll do better, and then about a 4 in 5 chance that they'll either do the same or maybe even do worse. I mean, you see charter schools closing down all over the country. And so we need to, if you're going to sell it, you need to sell it right and be honest with the people. Certainly in some cases, the school is in such a bad situation that maybe the charter school is the only option or the best option. But on the whole, we don't need to sell charter schools as this is going to solve everybody's problem, because statistically speaking, it doesn't.
We need to get to a break here in just a second, but I'd like to ask you one more question before we go. Insofar as doing better or doing the same or doing worse, what measures that?
Well, they measure it by test scores, basically.
How the students perform on test scores?
Absolutely. So they'll take the same students the way Stanford has done it. They'll take the students who've left a particular school, look at the students who are left behind, and see how they scored on math, science, reading, and English, and do the same thing there, and then they compare the scores, and that's kind of how they come up with that yardstick.
I want to get back to that after the break, but
You
we've
bet.
got to get to a break right
Certainly.
now. You're watching The Verdict with Representative Scott Inman. We're talking about charter schools and some second thoughts about them. We'll be right back.
It's a North American energy revolution. We're the fastest growing source of new oil and natural gas supplies in the world.
The shift to North American energy will create approximately 3 million jobs.
All that money we've been sending overseas, $400 billion a year. Imagine that staying in our economy. It's a game changer.
Real energy independence starts now, and it starts with Oklahoma.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Kent Myers here with Representative Scott Inman talking about second thoughts about charter schools. And let's kind of jump right into that, Scott. What do you see as the major disadvantages of charter schools?
Certainly. There are a few. I mean, you talk about what you do to the children who are left behind, who don't get to have access to that charter school, because sometimes the selection process is rather difficult to get in, and so you leave kids behind. And when you take some of the better and brighter kids out of a school, the brain drain that happens at that school who's left behind negatively affects those kids. I mean, I remember what it was like growing up in Del City, and you have some of the better honor students in a particular classroom, and it's sort of that rising tide lifts all boats. All the kids kind of try to achieve at that level. When you take some of those kids out, which naturally happens in this particular case, well, then it harms those kids left behind. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you look at the charter schools themselves, and by nature, there's certain regulations they don't have to follow. Some of that's good, some of that's bad. But you look around and you see...
Regulations of what kind?
Well, I mean, certain mandates that the state puts on public schools, on other public schools, that they don't put on the public charter schools.
I see.
In terms of teacher mandate, in terms of how much they have to pay them, in terms of certain library requirements, there's a bunch of them. But you have teachers there that get paid peanuts. They already pay them peanuts at the public schools that aren't charter schools. Then you turn around and look at charter schools, they pay them very, very little.
Pay her fewer peanuts.
They do, and that's a downside to it. And as we talk about expanding charter schools out, you hear a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans say that we need to shrink the number of schools we have. We need consolidation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, by adding more charter schools on top of communities that already have a full set of public schools, you're actually growing the base. And so therefore, not only now do you have to keep the lights on at Millwood, Douglas, and John Marshall, now you got to go keep the lights on at another building and another site. Well, that's more expensive. And since those dollars come from the state, it's not a private school, it's a public school. Since the dollars come from the state, you're adding more of a burden onto the system. And so there's another downside to it, I guess you could say.
Let's jump into a topic that David and I didn't get a chance to talk about, and that's rural charter schools. We know that most of our charter schools are in the two big metropolitan areas, and there was action, I think, perhaps, or at least talk about action in the legislature to expand that into the rural areas. What do you think about that, and what did the legislature do? Yeah,
there were two big issues this year. One about allowing for municipalities to charter schools, and the other one was to allow expansion of charter schools into rural Oklahoma. While I'm not opposed to allowing rural communities to start charter schools, I believe that you have to, if you're going to do it, you have to do it in such a way that you allow for local control. So if the local school board, the local community doesn't want that charter school, then they shouldn't be allowed, then somebody shouldn't be allowed to come in and force it down their throat. But what you see a lot of times with charter schools, are you see these for-profit entities who run these schools, who will come into a community and try to push it on the community to try to take those public dollars to basically pay their salaries. And under the current legislation that was passed to expand into rural Oklahoma, it has a provision in it that says even if the school board or if the local community says, on the whole, we really don't want this, they can come down to the State Department and say, we want to put the charter school in there anyway. And if the State Department says, go ahead, then that local community is overridden or vetoed. And I think that's what's wrong with the particular legislation.
That really takes away local control.
It does, it absolutely does. And so you have that problem, and then you'd look at the issue of, we have so many rural schools now who are just struggling to keep the doors open because of the budget cut after budget cut. All these last number of years. I said we're $400 million below where we were in 2008 when you adjust for inflation. Well, how in the world are these rural schools who can barely keep the doors open at one site going to be able to afford to support a charter school? Because at the end of the day, if you've got 100 kids in that school district in the Panhandle, for example, well, when you open up that charter school next door or across the street and you take 30 of those kids away, you still got the same number of kids, but you've got two sites that you now have to support. I don't think it makes financial sense. And so I have some real reservations about not properly funding the rural schools that are there and giving them the chance they need before you put a charter school on top of them.
Let me ask you, charter schools, and this will show my ignorance of charter schools, but what grade levels are covered in a charter school?
It just depends on how they want to do it. You could go, K through 12 if you want.
What do most of them here then? The 25 or so we've got now. Do you know how that
most
works
of them?
out?
Most of them are elementary schools. They try to pull them in that way, and I'm not opposed to that. But primarily that's where they are. You look at what happened in Oklahoma City when John Rex, the charter school, was open there. Mm-hmm. You've got a situation now where I think John Rex is a good school. I have no qualms about it, and I know lots of people who send their kids there, and they're good kids and great teachers and great parents. But now they're looking at a situation where when their kids sort of age out of John Rex. Where do they go? There's not a middle school or a high school charter school that they could send them to, and so now they're trying to solve that problem as well, which probably means more expansion, more dollars diverted from the schools in Oklahoma City right now who already are underfunded to open up another school.
What is your understanding generally of the admission requirements to get into a charter school, and who gets picked and who gets not picked?
Yeah, nationwide, those standards are all different. Sometimes they do it by a lottery. Sometimes they do it by a particular regional location. I know that, for example, you look at John Rex, and sometimes they say, well, we want to make sure that we take all these particular kids that would otherwise be going to a failing school in Oklahoma City, failing school as judged by the A through F standards. Right. And we're just going to allow those kids to come here. That's not exactly what John Rex does. You've got people who may live in Norman who work at Devon Energy, for example, and then they bring their kids there. Well, the idea behind John Rex was to hopefully allow some kids in inner city Oklahoma City a chance. Well, when you allow people who live in Norman who may not be having those same educational issues down there to bring the kids in, that shows you that the admission standards can be kind of fluid as to who gets in and why they get in.
What do you think is the impact on a community that has had a public school for 100 years or a long time, having it suffer and close because there's a charter school not in that area but close to that area that draws kids away and makes the local school no longer feasible? What's the impact on the community?
It's significant, and I think that's probably more of what you're looking at in rural schools. Because when you look at
what I had in mind.
That's right. In Oklahoma City, if you open up a charter school, Millwood, John Marshall, Dell City High School, Midwest City High School, they're all still going to exist. But when you go into the rural communities, what I think you're going to have happen is you're going to find a for-profit charter program is going to come, a company's going to come in and set up a charter school in a way to try to draw kids from multiple communities that may already have high schools. And when you do that, you're going to put a strain on those local community schools. And if they end up closing, what you end up doing is you end up really sort of stripping the identity of that community away from it. Because as you well know, Friday night lights, high school football in Oklahoma is huge. People rally around their schools there. The kids want to be able to go from their house to the school in under 10 minutes. They don't want to have to drive half an hour or more to get to school. And so if those local schools close, a lot of times what happens in rural Oklahoma is the town dries up because people will move to where that new school is, hindering the growth of the town that they left. And so there's some real unintended consequences that are potentially on the horizon.
What do you think about the argument that charter schools pay less to their teachers than public schools and therefore draw less qualified teachers?
Well, I know some teachers that have taught at charter schools, and I won't say that they're less qualified by any stretch. There may be some, but you could go to in any profession and you see you could see issues with quality, no matter what the workforce is. But my personal belief is this: if you want to hire the best and the brightest, whether you want to hire the best and brightest lawyer, doctor, teacher, engineer, you name it, doesn't matter what they do. You need to be able to offer a fair living wage that honors and respects those people for what they're doing. And when they're educating the next generation of Oklahomans, there's nothing more important, in my opinion, than educating our kids. As the father of two small girls, education is crucial to me and my wife. And so we're sort of saddened by the fact that you look back and you see teachers who may be working for 30 years and they start out at a little over $30,000, and over a 30-year period they may earn a $10,000 raise over that time. That's a shame, both in public schools, and then if they get paid less in charter schools, that's likewise a shame. And what you end up seeing there is not necessarily less quality in the charter school teacher, but you see a charter school teacher who may not want to stick around very long because they'll say, I'll do this for a couple of years, but then I got to go make more money someplace else, which negatively affects the kids in that charter school.
Scott, we have just about a minute left. What are your final thoughts for our viewers about what kind of second thoughts about charter schools they ought to have, or whatever else you'd like to tell them?
I'd like our viewers to understand that the public school system in Oklahoma is under great stress and duress. And while there are significant problems facing our public schools, charter schools vouchers are not the answer. They may be part of the overall solution, but they are not the answer. If we turn and divert money away from our public schools that are already underfunded to support these other programs, you're not going to see the improvement, the outcomes that you want on the kids that are left behind. And so what we've got to do is we've got to demand more out of our politicians to properly fund our schools, to properly ease ease the mandates on our local public schools, to allow our teachers to earn the wage that they need so you can continue to attract the best and brightest to teach our kids. That needs to be our focus. If we take our eye off the prize, I think we're going to see some outcomes that we're not real proud of.
Thank you, Scott. That has to be our last word on this show, but thank you so much for coming. You're watching The Verdict with Representative Scott Inman.
There are now 11 million of us who live here and work here. I was 15 when I came here 6 years ago. I raised my family here. I drive my truck to my job every day. The only difference between now and 6 years ago, I do it legally. I wanted to. Because this is my home.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
We are a very conservative family, and we believe in old-fashioned family values. We have a loving home there, and we love kids, and we have 5, 6 of our own. But I had no idea we were going to go into adoption, but it's been very gratifying.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Kent Myers closing up this show on the second of a two-part series on charter schools in Oklahoma. We hope it's been informative, and we really appreciate Representative Scott Inman giving us his time. Got a couple of websites to talk to you about. If you want to get a hold of Scott, you can go to okhouse.gov/members, and you can get a hold of Scott that way. Of course, The Verdict has its own website, theverdict.tv. Let us hear from you. And we, by the way, want to send a special thanks to Ella and Sophia Inman, who were here supporting us. That's it for this week. We'll see you next week.